Coming up on the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast.
A lot of the people that I work with or that, watch our stuff have already been through the ringer with all these different restrictive diets. Probably started cutting calories. Maybe they did like a plant-based thing. Maybe they did fasting. Maybe they did low carb. These are all just different forms of restriction, whether you're restricting calories, carbs, or anything else. A lot of stuff can just put a toll on the body, and it's not really a good long-term solution because you're not ending up fixing the key problems of why you were fat in the first place. No one is fat because they weren't on the carnivore diet. There's probably some other underlying reasons that exist there.
Hello, and welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I'm Brian Grin, and I'm here to give you actionable tips to get your body back to what it once was 5, 10, even 15 years ago. Each week, I'll give you an in-depth interview with a health expert from around the world to cut through the fluff and get you long-term sustainable results. This week, I interviewed Dalton from Analyze and Optimize. Dalton and Jack research and explore health from the Bioenergetic Viewpoint originated from Dr. Peat. We discuss some of the issues with birth control, along with the bioenergetic viewpoint of metabolic health. Is sugar to blame for obesity? The problem with restrictive diets, Dalton's metabolic boosting foods, and much, much more. Really enjoyed my interview with Dalton. This was the second time he's been on the podcast. Thanks again for listening and enjoy the interview. All right. Welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. My name is Brian Grin, and I have Dalton on. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. We did this once last year, and it was awesome. So we both put out a good amount of content in between. So I'm excited to keep this going, man. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, Dalton is you're missing your sidekick, Jack, with Analyze and Optimize. He had something that came up, but we're going to hit a lot of great topics today. So I know you're in Florida. Maybe give us a little brief synopsis of what you're up to now, and Analyze and Optimize, and sort of the goals with that company.
Yeah. So as far as A&O goes, we had a pretty good stretch of growth over the summer, mainly through Twitter, but also some of our videos really picked up on YouTube. So we essentially doubled our following in the past year or so. And that's been super exciting. And I guess now would be a good time to sort of introduce this, but we're also working on, we basically have set up a consultation service where we have a number of healthcare practitioners on staff. And there's been a lot of demand from people who follow us and watch our videos, especially as it pertains to gut issues. People are asking for like a lot of specific help. So, I've been offering messaging consults through Patreon for a while now, but my time's a bit limited and that it's a pretty cheap service. But with this new consultation service called Prism, we have a number of different healthcare practitioners on board, and everyone kind of is on the same page about bioenergetics, energy and structure, and how we view the body as a system. So it's going to be really exciting. It's very comprehensive, and it'll be a nice alternative for people who want specific help, who maybe have tried different things, have gone to different GI docs or whatever the case may be. It'll be really good for those people who are bought into the ideas of bioenergetics, but maybe need some personal help incorporating a lot of these ideas or understanding where to go next. So that's very exciting for us. And we should have that up and running by the end of 2023. So that's the big thing for us. And then, we started doing the solo streams, just face cam videos, because while we love the documentary style videos, they are quite a bit of a production. So it's been good to just do face cam videos and come in with my notes and my thoughts and kind of express it, and people really seem to like those in addition to the documentary style videos. So we just released one on birth control. It was like an hour and 20 minutes long. That was about a month ago now. So lots of fun stuff that we've done over the past year, and it's just the beginning. So we got a lot more places to go.
Yeah, no, I love the content, your YouTube videos, getting lots of views, so that's always good. And why don't we jump into the one we'll hit on the last two ones you did. Maybe we'll touch a little bit on the birth control one. I would imagine a lot of the audience are male, but I think it's important, even if you're male, to understand this, because you might have a significant other that has been on birth control for most of their lives. What was some of the things you learned from doing that video?
The birth control.
Yeah.
Well, it was a number of different things. I think the biggest thing is how confusing the literature becomes when you're talking about progesterone versus synthetic progestins. So the elevator pitch is basically that progesterone is the hormone that really helps support pregnancy. Obviously, you have estrogen as well, which is very important for growth. But progesterone is literally named as such as the progestational hormone. And when the levels of progesterone are elevated, then you obviously can't get pregnant again because the body understands that it's already pregnant. So it had been known pretty much like up to a century ago that administering enough exogenous progesterone could inhibit ovulation and would prevent pregnancy. But bioidentical progesterone is this like broad acting anti-stress sort of protective hormone that declines in aging and in menopause. So it seemed like it would be a perfect place to go. However, the pharmaceutical companies sort of came in and, you can't really patent a bioidentical hormone. And there were some issues with like bioavailability, et cetera. So they basically made synthetic analogs of progesterone called the synthetic progestins. And they are completely different in terms of their actions, mainly because they don't metabolize into a number of the important bioactive steroids that bioidentical progesterone does, but also because they tend to inhibit your body's endogenous production of progesterone, because your body kind of thinks that it's already getting enough progesterone. So you have this negative feedback loop that goes on. So you're kind of getting a double whammy there. And what's very frustrating is reading through a lot of the research, even people in the field will use the terms progesterone and progestin interchangeably. And that causes a lot of problems because, then you have women thinking that progesterone is bad, or that's the synthetic progestins are the same thing as taking progesterone or having high levels of progesterone. And then it becomes this whole complicated mess. So, it took me a while to really read through it enough to understand that, oh my God, pretty much every time that they're reporting cancer, or they're reporting heart disease, they're reporting endometrial problems, it's always with the synthetic progestins. And that's, because you can't really replace your bioidentical progesterone because it has all those critical functions. So that was a really big thing. And then also just kind of breaking open the whole estrogen thing. So oftentimes you hear that estrogen is protective for the heart, or it's really protective for your bones, or it's like very feminizing, or whatever the case may be. But it's interesting because, again, it's one of these things where in the early 20th century, it was pretty well understood that estrogen was really like a growth and proliferation hormone. Obviously, they knew that it had a role in the menstrual cycle and a role in reproduction. But in terms of its role in nature, it was known to play a big role in cancer. And it would also, you talk about phytoestrogens. These are some of these plant defense chemicals that are literally used to discourage herbivores from eating them because it makes them infertile. And then it was interesting to see how the entire dynamic got shift, or the narrative got shift around estrogen. And that was in large part because we had a bunch of industry coming in and making synthetic estrogens. You hear about these now xenoestrogens or endocrine disruptors. And because they were sort of introduced at the same time that they were developing birth control. Essentially what happened was that they started to, paint estrogen in a more positive light. And it ended up costing, lots of lives because of the toxicity induced by administering these exogenous estrogens. And then, things like DES and DDT, we're still kind of dealing with the consequences of those today. These persistent endocrine disruptors that are ultimately estrogenic in nature. But that I don't think was a coincidence that all those things kind of happened in unison.
What
and
made
then,
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just say, you could finish. Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, you had all of that happening throughout the mid 20th century. And then they really started to test a lot of these things in clinical trials. And it all culminated with this huge study, the Women's Health Initiative, where they were administering progestin and estrogen, comparing it to control. And they literally had to cut the study short in a lot of these cases because it was like very obvious that whether you were taking only estrogen or estrogen plus progestin, you were having increases in stroke, heart attack, breast cancer, even cognitive decline, things like dementia. So it's pretty astonishing that a lot of these, narratives still exist about these things when, you were never really going to get better evidence than that, that, these things are not good. These things are harmful. It was tested thousands of women, multiple years, and they had to end the trials early because of the harms that were happening. But I mean, a lot of these narratives still persist to this day, even though after that trial concluded, there was some backlash. But then they seemed to make a comeback thereafter.
So what made you want to sort of go down the rabbit hole of birth control and perhaps the consequences or the effects of it?
Well, we're really interested in figuring out different, just sort of like environmental factors that can cause illness, because, I guess the mainstream medical narrative is really that a lot of it's genetic, or, you can just take something to sort of mitigate the symptoms of whatever you're dealing with, but the causes are always unknown, or like they need more research, or whatever the case may be. But, we kind of come at things from the angle of, the baseline human experience should be one that is full of life and happiness and euphoria and good health. And, if you're not at that level, then something in the environment is causing that. So, I don't know exactly why we wanted to do birth control specifically. We just have a very long list of, whether it's mold, or whether it's heavy metals, or whether it's, endocrine disruptors, or whether it's any number of these drugs that, so many people are taking that can contribute to these things. We're trying to look at it from all angles and sort of decipher, what is contributing to these things. But I think birth control is a big one because it is so like normalized in the sense that, if you're around my age and you went to college recently, like it would probably be hard to find a girl who is not on birth control. And then, it's really unfortunate because it gets very normalized. And then, you obviously have like hookup culture and all this stuff going on. But the girls like really do suffer a lot of these consequences, and it doesn't get talked about. And they don't even realize that it might be a result of that, because, a lot of the girls that I've spoken with about this, like they don't really get a good rundown from their doctor about what the actual consequences are. Like what are the potential risks? What has this been linked to in the past? How does this work? Mm-hmm. And I think it because it's so widely used, and it's not really talked about in that sense, like people talk about the diet, like what's the best diet, that kind of thing. But for something like that, that's really interesting to me. Something that is like pretty ubiquitous in the environment that people don't even really think about, but it could in fact be contributing to a lot of these conditions.
Yeah, and I'll put a link in the show notes if people really want to dive into that video that you did. It's like about an hour long. Um, you also recently did one titled "The New Paradigm of Weight Loss," and a lot of different topics you went into regarding sort of your thoughts around what would be solutions for weight loss or and things that maybe might not work for a lot of people. Was there certain things, I mean, we can hit on a lot of them, but were there certain things that, sort of, I don't know, maybe that drew to you to do this video? I know you're part of the Pro-metabolic Viewpoint, which I've had Jay Feldman on and Georgie Dinkoff and Danny Roddy. So I've had quite a bit of the Pro-metabolic, and I know there's a rhetoric out there about, cutting calories and just lifting weight, or cutting calories and exercise should do the job, and doesn't necessarily, explain the entire picture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there were a number of reasons. I think it was probably because, I'd been talking about eating sugar and eating saturated fat and like not restricting your calories, and, even eating more is a good way to raise your metabolism. And that everyone, the the pushback that I often hear is, oh, well, yeah, I mean, maybe it make me feel good, but I'm just going to get fat. Like, or everyone who does the bioenergetic thing, they're all fat, which is an interesting critique. Because
Yeah,
because I don't think Ray was overweight. Danny was not overweight. Jay's not overweight. I'm not overweight. Jackson, like, you can just go down the line. There's but there is this narrative that, sugar makes you fat, and that, you don't want to be eating more, whatever the case may be.
It can definitely be confusing for the average person out there. That, I mean, having a podcast and having different viewpoints on, I'm sure one week I had, gosh, names are all, but like, trying to think of his name. I can't think of his name, but we talked about omega-3s and how important they are. And then another week, we got, Jay saying not a big fan of omega-3s. So there's definitely can be a confusing rhetoric out there.
Yeah. I mean, it's good that, you have platforms like this where, you can get differing opinions on these things for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think the sugar causing insulin resistance or sugar making you fat, that is very pervasive. And I thought it was pretty important for people to understand. Really, the main point that I was getting at is that there's a difference between going on a diet and losing weight, or going on a regimen that is strictly put forth in order to lose weight, versus someone who is lean without having to think about it, or like just, basically eating intuitively and being naturally lean. There's a difference between those two states. And it's just unfortunate because a lot of the people that I work with, or that, watch our stuff, have already been through the ringer with all these different restrictive diets. Probably started cutting calories. Maybe they did like a plant-based thing. Maybe they did fasting. Maybe they did low carb. These are all just different forms of restriction, whether you're restricting calories, carbs, or anything else. A lot of stuff can just put a toll on the body, and it's not really a good long-term solution, because you're not ending up fixing the key problems of why you were fat in the first place. Like, no one is fat because they weren't on the carnivore diet. There's probably some other underlying reasons that exist there. And then there's just people, who I see in my life. And it's I think it's a pretty damaging sort of narrative to them, because if you've been struggling with your weight for years, if not decades, and you're sitting there like, I don't know how I can eat less. Like, I'm really not eating that much. But I just feel like anytime I do eat, like I just blow up, like I just gain weight. Like I don't understand why this is. And then, you just get the classic response of like, oh, we just need to restrict more. You just need more discipline. You just need to cut your food down more. You just need to exercise more. And that ultimately is just going to make things worse. And I also think it's important for people to understand that, your obesity or your being overweight is just, you can't really isolate that from your other health problems. And I think that's very important for people to understand, because the calories in, calories out mantra, while it is like technically true, it's not super helpful when you're trying to practically apply these things, because then the take home message for most people is like, oh, well, if I want to lose weight, I have to do this. But then if I want to solve my other health problems, then I have to do something different. When in reality, what we're trying to do is, improve your health holistically, in the sense that if your digestion is smooth, if your energy levels are good, if your stress is low, if you're fulfilled with your life, if you're satisfied after your meals, if you have good libido, all of these things are what I would consider to be signs of health. And you should be able to have all of that and enjoy your food and not have to think about things, in terms of restricting yourself. And you should be able to have a lean body composition on top of that. That is the ultimate healthy organism from my view, not, being very lean, but having to, sacrifice libido or sacrifice digestion or, have lower energy or worse sleep, and doing that through forceful restriction. Because a lot of people, you'll end up running into problems because the body always wins in the end. Your body knows how much of certain nutrients it needs, and calories are in fact a nutrient. And that seems to be forgotten as well. But there's a reason why in the long run, the vast majority, I think it's like 95 plus% of people that try different diets like fail within 5 years. And that's because it really is a short-term strategy, going on like a cutting diet or whatever, to lose fat. It's not really like solving your long-term issue of why does your body have the propensity to put on more fat.
Where would you say a good place for someone to start? Because I think a lot of times people do start with the sort of restrictive mindset, right? Like, okay, I need to cut this out or I need to cut that out. Obviously exercise has its benefits, but we all know that losing weight, exercise is such a small piece of that, I would say, right? Like you want to obviously have if you talk about good metabolism, building muscle obviously is, I think, important, it's like a glucose sink. But, that's just sort of one piece of the puzzle. But a lot of times people start with sort of this restrictive mindset. And I've done it myself. I mean, I've been through fasting, and to this day, I still do. I wouldn't say I fast as much. I probably eaten more since I've talked with all you guys. And the interesting thing is when I started to eat more, initially I put on weight, but then that came back to my initial my baseline. So I've actually, just to say, I've added 700 calories, but let's say I was at 175 and then I might have gone to 180, but now I'm back to about 173, 174 with eating that additional amount, which is a good thing. So I know that doesn't happen with everyone. That's just my case. But where would you say a good place for someone to start if they're thinking, well, okay, I don't need to cut out sugar. I don't need to cut necessarily how much I'm eating throughout the day. Where should they start?
Well, I think you'd be surprised, your experience of saying, okay, I'm not going to try to restrict, or I'm going to try to eat more based on my cravings, and then gaining some weight in the short term and then losing it thereafter once the body adjusts. That's actually pretty common. So in my case, I basically had been chronically dieting, fasting and whatnot for 2 or 3 years. So then when I started, incorporating more sugars and things into my diet, I gained way more than you did. Actually, I gained like 20 or 30 pounds. But the thing is,
yeah. Okay. So, and you're not like the biggest guy. I mean, you're not, so that's a decent amount percentage wise.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it was substantial. But the thing is that first of all, I've lost, the vast majority of that. I'm still like a little bit over where I started from, but I honestly think it's a good thing because I was probably too lean.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think that is a good place to start in the sense that as much as we talk about health problems that are caused by, having too much weight or being insulin resistant and things, there's an equal amount of risk in the opposite, which is, forcefully restricting yourself and being chronically sort of underfed. There's a host of health problems that are associated with that as well. So it's actually pretty common for people to start putting on weight, and then as we continue to improve other aspects of their health, then over time you might need to eat less, or you might your metabolic rate will probably compensate for the amount that you're eating. So in my case, I was very lean and I started to gain weight when I was eating, more sugars and just not restricting myself generally, not skipping meals and things. I did start to gain weight, but my stress was noticeably lower. I was able to sleep better. My sexual function started to get better. My digestion started to improve. My mood was better. I wasn't like as irritable and things. And those are all important to consider
Right.
because yeah, you might need a period signaling abundance to your body, which is really the sort of overarching theme here, is that you want to signal to your body that this is a time of abundance, even if it's in a state of scarcity to start, where it's slowing the metabolic rate and it's turning on the processes that allow it to store more fat because it's perceiving that there is a scarcity in the environment. You might need to give that signal of abundance, and it might take a little while for the body to sort of get out of that state, in order for you to get to where you want to be, which is, eventually getting back to your body composition, but maintaining the benefits of having the extra food, of having the higher metabolic rate. So, that is typically what I tell people. I have people that come to me and say, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm eating. I want to lose 30 pounds. And I'm like, okay, that's not what you want to hear, but let's not focus on the weight loss to start. Let's focus on how your health is otherwise.
It's
And then,
I was just going to say, it's interesting that you bring it up and you come from that viewpoint, because I think we're like society. It's like we look at someone and you just make a blanket statement thinking, well, if they're overweight, then they must not be healthy, which is, I mean, obviously weight and how you carry it is one aspect of health, but obviously, like you're talking about, there's other things that you should be looking at, such as like stress, libido, even like your skin or your hair, hormonal balance, things like that, well-functioning gut, that are just as important as just that sort of, I guess, how you look from the outside as far as weight is concerned.
yeah, absolutely. And again, that's because there's a difference between being forcefully lean and being naturally lean. And if you're the type of person that needs to forcefully make themselves lean through all this restriction, there's probably a reason why your body is trying to maintain you in the state of having more fat on your body. It doesn't just do that, nonsensically. There's typically a reason for that.
So what would you say? I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but what would you say to someone? You were talking about, let's say individuals 20, maybe someone comes to you, they're 65. You're in your 20s, right? I mean, you can get away with stuff in your 20s that you can't get away with when you're in your 50s or 60s. And so this individual's got visceral fat, it's probably get 20, let's just say 20 pounds, 25 pounds overweight. So most of that for males is comes in the gut. I think you were going down that road before, but what would you say to that individual, who maybe hasn't been restricting at all throughout his entire life? Okay. Because I think that this could be the majority of individuals.
Yeah, so I think in that case, again, it's important to look sort of holistically at what other symptoms they may have. But in general, the main dietary things that I think are very important, and I think it's pretty clear, especially from the animal studies, but also from human studies, looking at what is the optimal like metabolic boosting diet. It would be something that's pretty moderate in protein, low to moderate in fat, with the vast majority of that being saturated if possible, or at least not polyunsaturated. Trying to restrict that as much as possible, while having the higher amount. Basically, you want the fat to be more saturated than anything, and then the rest, like the vast majority of the actual energy, should be coming from simple sugars. And there's a number of reasons for that, but I think particularly sugar, as in sucrose, as in glucose plus fructose, seems to be the best in terms of bolstering the overall metabolic rate. So if you have visceral fat, there seems to be a number of different factors there, but you can definitely get there by overdoing the polyunsaturated fat. And then for things like liver fat accumulation, you might often hear that sugar causes fatty liver, or like it's more lipogenic. But some of the main controllers of that are hormonal. So if you have chronically elevated cortisol, that'll actually increase your propensity to convert sugar into fat, rather than oxidizing it. And it's the same thing with chronic inflammation. So one of the key characteristics in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is that they have systemic inflammation, and these people have a greater propensity to turn sugar into fat because of that elevated inflammation. Whereas a healthy individual, they would need to consume massive quantities of sugar to end up converting it into fat. So those are some key things to look at. And a lot of that inflammation is, of course, driven by the polyunsaturated fats. So those would be the big dietary things. I think, looking at different symptoms, gut, I keep bringing up gut and digestion because it's very important, mainly as a chronic source of inflammation systemically, but also as a chronic source of elevated serotonin, and serotonin being this sort of ubiquitously elevated controller of metabolism, not only in the brain, but really systemically. And in fact, I think Big Pharma is trying to develop some inhibitors of serotonin synthesis peripherally as treatment for obesity and diabetes and thing. And that's because serotonin represents this big break on the metabolism if it's elevated in excess. So most of the vast majority of your serotonin is produced in the gut, and that's in response to irritation, inflammation, and excess bacteria load in the gut. So, a lot of these things can be difficult to even get a hold of until you get the GI function normalized. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really not a fan of these new semaglutide and things like that. So I think it's Ozempic and I forgot the Wegovy, the other names
Weight
for them,
loss.
but
yeah.
So these drugs, they do work for weight loss in the short run, but they do that by suppressing your appetite, and they ultimately elevate the amount of serotonin that's in your gut. So the GI side effects of these drugs are like off the charts. I think there was one study that showed that basically almost 50% of people that took it developed either diarrhea or chronic just abdominal pain or nausea or something to go with it. And that's just like, I think that's a good sort of microcosm of how we are looking at this situation, that like, oh, well, if I lose weight, it's okay to completely nuke my gut function in the process. That's like considered a net win for your health. But in my opinion, nothing could be further from the truth. So tangent aside on that, that would be a big place to start. And then, getting some blood work can definitely be helpful. So for someone, who's older and may have, put on some weight over the years, especially if you're a male, Looking at the androgen status is very important. So looking at testosterone, free testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, prolactin is a really good marker of not only excess serotonin but also excess estrogen. And then also looking into DHT as well. Some people could benefit from replacing those hormones. And speaking of replacing the hormones, another good thing to look at is obviously thyroid hormone, because that's a big controller of the metabolic rate. And historically, we would have been eating more actual thyroid gland because we used to consume the whole animal. So I don't want people to think that it's like, oh, so you're just telling us to like hop on all these like synthetic hormones instead. It's actually more unnatural for us to not eat thyroid gland and to not consume those hormones. Because, again, historically, we would eat the whole animal. That includes the thyroid gland. So those are some big places to start. I normally always start in the gut because it seems like nowadays everybody has something going on there. And that is typically a huge break on the metabolism. And it just makes everything so much harder to deal with from there. But I think, if that is pretty much in check, let's say the gut function is pretty good. I think thyroid, androgens, and estrogen are another good place to start, in addition to the dietary stuff. And in general, just chronically elevated cortisol is a big one, because in the short term, cortisol is, it's a stress hormone. So it acts to like raise your energy expenditure, and it liberates like a lot of fat from the tissues then. But in the long run, cortisol actually sort of does the opposite, and it kind of increases your propensity to store more fat, because it turns on specific enzymes that are involved in the fat making and fat storing process. Again, in the long run. So those are some good places to start. And then just in general nutrition, making sure to get, especially the B vitamins. A lot of people that I work with, benefit a lot from like a B complex. And that's because these vitamins are all so critical to the proper oxidation of glucose, which seems to be the thing that is ubiquitously impaired in obesity and in insulin resistance. So making sure that you're covered on the B vitamins is really critical to ensure that you can properly metabolize the glucose. And once you can do that, everything else kind of falls into place. But yeah, I think those would be the big places to start. Obviously, it's not going to work for everyone because everyone's in a different situation.
Right.
But there's always things to look for. I don't think it's ever the case where someone is just like screwed. There's always something in the environment that you can analyze and look at and manipulate to your advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I think in an ideal world, if you could somehow, maximize your energy, like, you talk about the pro-metabolic state is more than just about weight loss, right? It's about, maximizing your mitochondrial energy and your vitality and, ways to do this. It's like to some people who just, if you look at the mainstream rhetoric, it's like the opposite of what you've been told, right? You talk about sugar, right? Sugar's been linked to so many things, just, disease in general. And then when you hear your viewpoint, you can understand why there's pushback from people who have been hearing with the same thing. It's like the same thing like with saturated fats, right? They've been demonized for years. I'm sure you've done videos on that before.
Yeah. And it's funny because there's always some truth to it. So,
Sure.
we were, I was just talking about how, if you do have elevated cortisol and you do have chronic inflammation, then eating the sugar can, be more readily converted into fat. So if you're testing people that are already unhealthy and you give them sugar and then you see an increase in visceral fat or liver fat, it's not exactly surprising. But then, is the blame to be put on the sugar itself when it's doing, other things that are helpful? I don't particularly think so. And then another interesting just sort of comment on that is that a lot of the animal studies that are done, talking about fructose are actually done with isolated fructose,
Right.
and not, fructose that you get like in fruit, which has, obviously a lot of other components from the fruit, but it also has glucose, or even table sugar, which is just glucose and fructose together. And isolated fructose tends to behave a lot differently than if it's co-administered with glucose or it's in the sucrose form. So, for example, it's very poorly absorbed when it's in the isolated form, and then that can cause a bunch of gut problems because it ends up fermenting, causing gas and diarrhea and things and bacterial overgrowths. And then, of course, that is going to result in systemic inflammation and all these problems that we've been talking about. So yeah, I mean, I've heard a number of these arguments, and there's always like a bit of truth. Like none of them, well, some of them are like just completely made up, but
Right.
there's always at least a reason why the narrative exists. But that's why I find it very fascinating, is because once you actually start to pick these things apart, you can end up with a much different picture of what's going on.
Yeah, and there's a ton. You talk about like studies done, but like these are epidemiology studies, where it's associations in groups of people, and they try to infer a cause. So, excuse me, instead of like, I'm sure there are some, but like most of the studies that are demonizing sugar are based on like observational sort of cohorts. And so I think with the studies, you got to sort of see, you got to take it with a grain of salt and make sure that it's like you said, some of these studies are just showing like just fructose, but like if you have a piece of fruit, like an orange, that's glucose and fructose. That's like almost 50-50.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, I like to, are you into sports at all?
Sure.
So I like to liken this like reading studies and, experiencing real life. I like to liken that to like reading stats in sports and then like actually watching the game. So, like if you're only reading the stats or like you're only reading the studies and you're kind of just trying to base everything off of that, you're only going to get a part of the picture. You still need to go out and actually try these things and, see what other people are doing and see how it all fits together, because it should all make sense in the end. And it's the same thing like in sports, how you can't just look at the stat sheet. You need to actually watch the game. Ideally play the game and get a better understanding of, oh, that's why that stat is this way. That makes more sense. But yeah, I try not to be like dismissive per se of any of that type of evidence. Epidemiology is not something that like I personally use because of the reasons that you sort of pointed out. I mean, I think it can have use. But when someone comes to me and they tell me I did this and this happened, I don't just look at that and say like, oh, well, it's just an anecdote, so it doesn't matter. Like, no, it happened, and I think it's important to consider, because at the end of the day, like if you're trying to affect individual people, you should try to, understand how everything works, not try to dismiss anecdote or whatever the case may be, or only focus on studies, like you said. So,
yeah, I mean, you touched on a lot of great things. So gut health, obviously really important. What are some ways, I've talked to Jay about this. I mean, he talks about endotoxin load, and what are some ways people can, sort of gut could be sort of a confusing topic, because it's like, well, how do I clean up my gut health, right? Like there's so much on the market, these probiotics, prebiotics. Where do people start? Where would you say people should start with that?
So I think it's important for people to understand like what the actual function of the different parts of the gut are. So your stomach is really there mainly to, it's incredibly acidic, and it breaks down most of the protein, and it also serves to kill a lot of the bacteria that might be in the food. So those are the two main functions of the stomach, is to break down protein. It does some absorption, but it does a lot of sterilization. The small intestine and the colon, the large intestine, they do have some like antimicrobial properties. But the small intestine is mainly for digestive enzymes and absorption. So the colon then basically takes whatever hasn't been absorbed or broken down or whatever the case may be. And that's where the vast majority of the bacteria are. And anything that is not absorbed in the upper part of the GI tract reaches the colon, and it either gets excreted in whole or more likely it gets fermented by the bacteria that are there. So in terms of the way that I look at these things is, based on my experience and people that I've worked with and, obviously literature as well, the primary driver of a lot of these chronic digestive issues is excess serotonin in the gut. And that excess serotonin is mainly driven by excess bacteria and mechanical irritation. So indigestible either fibers or just different components of the food that aren't getting absorbed up higher. So I think that a good way of looking at it is that, you really want to try to optimize what is going on in the upper GI tract so that you're breaking down and absorbing as much of the food as possible, because you really want to leave as little as possible to be fermented in the colon. Stuff is always going to reach there. You're never going to have like a completely sterile gut or colon, and you honestly wouldn't want that anyway. But in terms of, practically, I think most people are dealing with bacterial overgrowths, or they could be dealing with fungal overgrowths or whatever the case may be. But in terms of making the upper GI tract more robust, increasing the amount of stomach acid can be huge. Things like thiamine or vitamin B1 can be very critical for that, because increasing the amount of carbon dioxide serves as a precursor to stomach acid in a weird mechanism. But that's really critical. And then as far as the small intestine is concerned, it's funny, actually eating sugar does increase the amount of absorption that goes on in the small intestine. And then you also have the digestive enzymes that are made by the pancreas secreted into the small intestine. And, you want those, basically firing on all cylinders as well. The pancreas mainly consumes glucose for its metabolism, and that's very important to focus on. Another interesting thing there is that, again, a lot of the B vitamins can increase the amount of digestive enzymes that you're producing in the pancreas, again, because they're so important for glucose metabolism, and the pancreas needs that energy in order to secrete the enzymes, or make the enzymes rather. So yeah, really focusing on those things, and then increasing the motility through the GI tract is going to be critical, because one of the most important hallmarks of something like IBS is not only do you have an increased fecal load, so basically you make more stool, and that's because you're fermenting more of your food and you're creating more bacteria from it, and you're creating more waste because of that. But you also, even in diarrhea, you have dysmotility. So you have a longer period of time that the food stays in your system. And that just gives the bacteria more of a chance to, take hold and ferment. So in terms of the diet, I think that you probably want to eat a diet that's as digestible as possible, meaning simple sugars, animal proteins, whole saturated fats. Those are all, pretty easily digested and absorbed in the upper GI tract. Whereas things like intact starches and fiber, and some of these other undercooked plant foods can have a number of components. I mentioned the fiber that can be fermented or not absorbed in the upper GI tract, and then that ultimately can just irritate the colon, produce more serotonin and more bacteria, and then the problem continues. So I think that is a really good start. A lot of people can benefit from direct antimicrobials, whether that's something like mastic gum or something like I'm blanking. Oh, like fat soluble vitamins. Those have direct antimicrobial effects, and those can be very useful, and there's tons of other naturally occurring ones as well. Some
Is that,
people might.
I was just going to say, do you think, like, obviously you have the whole like carnivore craze? Do you think part of the reason why that helps some individuals because they're cutting out some of these fibers and these gut stressors from, obviously just having purely meat diet?
Yeah, absolutely. You see some incredible carnivore success stories where people are like basically putting their Crohn's or their IBDs into remission. And I don't think it's really a coincidence because if you're eating mostly meat, you are, you're going to be able to break down and absorb the vast majority of that in the upper GI tract, and then there's very little left over in the colon, and to irritate and foster the growth of more bacteria. So yeah, I think that is probably the main reason why a lot of people benefit from it. There are a lot of good things about something like a carnivore diet. I just think that it's lacking in a couple key places. So for instance, very, very common story that happened to me and has happened to a lot of people that I work with is they'll be sick and then they'll go on keto, fasting, carnivore, whatever the case may be, and then they'll feel really, really good for like 6 to 12 months, and then shit will kind of hit the fan. They'll start to develop some problems, and a lot of the times they end up developing bacterial overgrowths again. And it's almost kind of analogous to the obesity issue because you didn't really solve the problem. You were kind of just taking out foods that were exacerbating the problem. But if you had an existing digestive condition, you didn't completely solve it just by eating the carnivore diet. It's more, I think you need to lower the amount of bacteria. You need to increase the metabolism overall so that you can have more digestion, more absorption, and more motility. And then in the long run, you'll be better off. But it's very common. I have plenty of people that have come to me because I posted this long thread on Twitter a couple months ago about serotonin in the gut and my experience, being carnivore fasting and then really developing one of these problems and then needing to add back in carbs. And then ultimately I need to take antibiotics in order to really get it under control. And then I had a bunch of people, commenting and messaging me saying like, thank you. Like, this is exactly what happened to me. Like, things were going great for so long. And then I kind of crashed and, now I have bloating. Now I have gas. Now I have the coated tongue, all these different things. And, I guess I had to be like the sacrificial lamb to come out and make people aware of that. But it's very common. But yeah, like you said, at first people can benefit from not having the irritating fibers, the undercooked starches, the undercooked vegetables, nuts, beans, things like that, and a bunch of things like food colorings, things like different emulsifiers that are added to different packaged foods, or even packaging itself. I mean, there have been some studies that I posted on Twitter. Basically, we're showing that there were parabens and there were it wasn't BPA, but there were different like basically we were talking about endocrine disruptors before, but these things actually make their way into a lot of different packaged foods because if it's wrapped in plastic or whatever the case may be, or even canned, you can get a good amount of that ends up in the food, and that can irritate the gut as well. So, but yeah, when you're carnivore, you eliminate a lot of those things, and yeah, it can make you feel awesome for a while. But then ultimately, I just think that the lack of carbohydrate is probably just a chronic stressor on the system to the point where it's kind of suppressing the immune system. And the immune system really needs to be, firing on all cylinders in order to keep this in check. And if you're not supporting the metabolism, for the digestion, the absorption, and the motility, then things are going to be slow. You're not going to be absorbing. You're not going to be breaking down the food properly. And then it's kind of just going to be sitting there fermenting. And that's going to, ultimately lead to a lot of these problems.
Lots of good stuff. Lots of good stuff. We're where I was going to go from here is let's just talk a little bit about like sort of the overriding view of the pro-metabolic space, and if someone's never even touched that space. I know we've talked about some of it. Where would they start? And then what would be like a good first step for that person, maybe who's tried everything?
Yeah. So I would love for people to read Ray's articles. So just raypeat.com. That's a really good place for a lot of people to start. It might be a bit too technical. Unfortunately, in today's sort of day and age, you kind of need to at least have a decent understanding of what's going on biochemically and physiologically. It's not impossible to understand. I think people can pick these things up. But really, I guess the elevator pitch is that the energy that you are capable of producing as an organism, or really any system that exists, is what determines how complex it can be and how it can maintain its order. And if we think of diseases as basically like a loss of structure, a loss of order, or a loss of proper functioning, that ultimately leads to this idea that, pretty much any disease is a result of the organism not being able to provide sufficient amounts of energy. And, this really resonates with a lot of people who have been dealing with health problems because, it seems like everyone's tired. And it's kind of sad that it happens this way. But yeah, I mean, one of the most common things that people experience is just like chronic fatigue. Whether or not you have an official diagnosis for that is one thing. But, if you come at things from the angle of, we're really going to focus on your energy, like that is our primary objective, is to increase your metabolism and to increase the amount of energy that you're outputting so that you can live the life that you want. You can go out and talk to people and socialize. You want to start new projects. You want to, go learn an instrument. You want to go play sports, do whatever it is that you like, because so many people are really in a situation where it's like, I do like those things, but I just don't have the bandwidth for it. Like I don't have the energy for it. So I think it resonates with a lot of people there, but that is ultimately the elevator pitch, is that we're trying to increase the rate of metabolism with all of these weird things. It might at first it might be like, so these people are telling me to eat sugar, and then, but I'm also supposed to eat carrots, and then something about gelatin or aspirin. Like, but I promise, if once you start looking into this stuff, the dots do connect. Because the primary brake on energy production systemically in general, we characterize as stress. And stress is something that everyone experiences, obviously. But trying to focus on raising the energy and lowering the stress, and those two kind of supporting each other and becoming this positive feedback loop is really what we're trying to get at. Yeah.
Well said. All right, Dalton, lots of great stuff. Best place for people to find you: YouTube, Analyze and Optimize, and Instagram.
Yeah, so YouTube, like you said, Analyze and Optimize. On Instagram, we're at Analyze and Optimize. Twitter, we are at Outdoctrination, so like indoctrination but with an out. And then we're on a number of different platforms. So I can send you our big link bio, which has all of our
right,
all the supplements that we have talked about and all of the content, and soon to be some more consultation options for people if they're interested in getting some more help. But yeah, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, second time. So tell Jack we said hi. And
we'll do.
Yeah, I will leave all that information in the show notes so people can check you out and learn more about what you guys are up to. So thanks so much.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, man.
Thanks for listening to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I understand there are millions of other podcasts out there, and you've chosen to listen to mine, and I appreciate that. Check out the show notes at briangrin.com for everything that was mentioned in this episode. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend or family member that's looking to get their body back to what it once was. Thanks again and have a great day.